Corruption and the education sector in Nigeria is no doubt a serious matter that needs thorough interrogation for it to be resolved and addressed appropriately. Given the time available to me, I may not do more than barely scratch the surface of the formidable challenges associated with corruption in the education sector, or indeed corruption and the education sector. Perhaps only a commissioned research project will do justice to the issues. Mr. President, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Nigeria has unenviably been dubbed as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It is also said to be one of the world's most complex corruption environments, and it is perennially ranked in the bottom quartile of the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. We may quarrel with how Transparency International measures corruption or the criteria it uses. Unfortunately, the perception has been created in the Committee of Nations that we are one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And as we all know, perception can sometimes be more dangerous than the reality. This means, therefore, we have to do everything possible to address corruption in all its dimensions. This relatively very poor record and ranking is essentially on account of the humongous corruption associated with what is known about the Nigerian public sector, especially at the federal level, but also across all tiers of governance in the Federation. In a recent study, it has been observed that corruption is the single greatest obstacle preventing Nigeria from achieving its enormous potential. It drains billions of dollars a year from the country's economy, stymies development, and weakens the social contract between the government and its people. And Nigerians struggle daily to cope with its effects. Also, in that recent study, 20 overarching contexts and sectors that are especially vulnerable to corruption in Nigeria have been identified, as well as 28 corruption tactics in 8 behavioral categories. This document succinctly highlights the extent and magnitude, as well as the multifarious dimensions of corruption in the Nigerian political economy. But there is no time to go into all this, but it's a report that I highly recommend to those who are interested to know the details. No doubt, the endemic and pervasive nature of corruption in Nigeria negatively impacts human security, as well as democratic and socio-economic development. This is essentially because the nature, extent, and dimensions of corruption are no doubt associated with bad governance and the inadequacy of institutional framework to effectively address it. Hence, public officials occupying public offices in trust regrettably convert those for private gain, often with impunity and disregard for due process, accountability, and ethical conduct. It is no doubt noteworthy that a lot has been done, especially by the ICPC, EFCC, and other institutions, and I must say they have done this very commendably since 2015 to tackle corruption in the Nigerian public sector. but a lot more still needs to be done. Efforts need to be redoubled, lessons ought to have been learned, strategies need to be reviewed and re-strategized, and more sophisticated weapons in court need to be acquired and deployed to kill corruption. For, as Mr. President was reported to have said several years back, if we do not kill corruption, corruption will kill us or kill Nigeria. So ultimately, addressing corruption decisively and impactfully, if not permanently, in the Nigerian public sector would require remarkable systemic value additions to our governance and to our democratic development as a country. In the short to medium term, however, a comprehensive, targeted, sectoral, and multi-tier anti-corruption campaigns with an excellent legal framework, strong anti-corruption institutions, led by selfless and fearless public officials, would bring about the desirable incremental positive changes. Clearly, we need to focus on this while we also work hard to improve and develop our country's governance framework and systems and accelerate democratic development. And a key aspect of this is no doubt improving the integrity of our elections, because that's how we can elect good quality people who can help improve our governance system. But I've been asked to speak about corruption and the education sector, and I will focus my attention on that, and I will try to do that very briefly because of the time factor. But let me say that in this presentation, I have merged the three dominant definitions of corruption globally. And there is a definition by the United Nations which sees corruption as abuse of power for private gain. There is also the definition by Transparency International which says corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. But there is also the World Bank's definition of corruption, which says corruption is abuse of office, not power, for private gain. So to my mind, corruption means abuse of power for selfish, private gain by appointed or elected persons assigned to a public office. So this is the way and the manner in which I look at the issue of corruption in the education sector, as well as corruption under the education sector. I think the Minister of Education tried to draw our attention to that distinction. Now, with regards to corruption and the education sector, I think it's important to say that there are two ways to look at this. The first one is to look at corruption within the education sector. And the second way is to look at the way and manner by which corruption in the larger public sector has impacted on the education sector. And of course, all of these have very profound consequences, which really are cause for concern. But before doing this, I identified the Nigerian public sector. I am not going to waste time on that, but it's important to recognize that when we talk about public sector, it ranges, education sector, it ranges from the primary to secondary to post-secondary. And I have provided statistics in the paper, which I believe will be circulated, so that we can understand the extent of the growth of our education sector. But the point I want to emphasize is that the Nigerian education sector, especially the tertiary education component of this sector, and particularly the universities, has grown phenomenally, especially since the early 2000s, when it was widely opened up for private sector investment and participation. Ironically, it was a case of rapid expansion and growth without, in my view, adequate planning, financing, and careful, effective regulation. With the result that there has been a remarkable expansion of enrollment in spite of the almost exponential increase in the number of institutions. But the two issues related to education, access and quality, have been compromised because of this phenomenal growth without careful planning. And I think a lot of the so-called crisis in the education sector in Nigeria, particularly in the tertiary education sector, is attributable to this phenomenal expansion without careful planning and without adequate control. There are two broad dimensions, as I mentioned, of corruption in the education sector, one within, one without, as it impacts. So specifically, with regards to corruption within the education sector, I would like to say as follows. As is the case within all sectors of the Nigerian political economy, education sector is continuously being perforated from within by incidences of corruption and the consequences of this. And from the primary to the tertiary levels of education provisioning, there are significant numbers and indicators of corruption which really abound. Any discussion of the Nigerian education sector invariably focuses on the so-called crisis in the education sector. And quite often, people pay attention to poor funding, resulting in poor infrastructure, poor conditions of service, poor working environment, inadequacy of teachers and laboratories, and the poor quality of teachers. But I think what is often not recognized is the way and the manner in which all of these dimensions are actually further complicated and intensified by persistent and pervasive corruption from within. And from both primary to tertiary educational institutions, the types and the evidence and the incidences of corrupt practices have increased remarkably. And these are not limited to the following. Of course, bribery is key, theft, direct theft is key, diversion of funds as well as equipment in educational institutions is another factor. Nepotism and favoritism in appointments and promotion of teachers, including not just teachers, all the staff, embezzlement of funds by officials, extortion of contractors and the suppliers by management staff, absenteeism by both management staff and the teaching and other staff, extortion of money from students and parents, either for admission or for grades, or even for issuance of transcripts, certificate racketeering, exploitation of students, whether sexually or in many other ways. All these are incidences of corruption which abound, which are documented, and they cut across the entire education system. The type of corruption which is most pervasive and prevalent at the primary and secondary levels is what Transparency International calls petty corruption. And the World Bank calls it quiet corruption. And these are notably bribery and maladaptive practices, such as absenteeism or what we call gift giving, but which we can try to rationalize through cultural practices, but which really have serious negative consequences on education delivery in terms of quality and in terms of access. In fact, according to Transparency International, using 2013 figures, 47% of all public sector institutions in sub-Saharan Africa are affected by this petty corruption. And I think regrettably, Nigeria also tops the rank in terms of incidences of these in our educational institutions. On the other hand, in the tertiary education institutions, prevalent and pervasive corrupt practices include deals with contractors and suppliers to rig contracts, extortion of contractors and suppliers, extortion of students for admission and grade, which I have mentioned earlier on, and racketeering or sexual harassment or exploitation of students through the sale of handouts, which are generally fraudulently prepared. They were not as a result of the intellectual activity of the teacher or lecturer, but largely are stolen from other public materials and reproduced and then sold to the students. And sometimes if they don't buy, they bear the consequences in terms of either being failed deliberately and so on and so forth. So these are the dimensions of corruption within the education sector. And I will come back to the consequences later. But then there is corruption in the wider public sector, the way in which it affects the educational institutions. And in particular, I want to focus on 3 recent examples, which really need to be addressed by all the anti-corruption agencies, because this is also undermining the quality of products and even the quality of the entire system. For example, there are examples of reform policies which are formulated with very good intentions, but which are often circumscribed by endemic corruption in the public sector and in their application to the education sector. And I want to give 3 examples of this. The first example is the reform policy on the Procurement Act. And it's a very commendable, very worthy reform policy to deal with the issue of corruption as it affects contracts and service provisioning in the public sector. The second is the requirement by the National Assembly that vice chancellors should appear in person to defend their budgetary proposals, contrary to the previous practice in which the National Universities Commission sits with vice chancellors, listens to their budgets, they defend it, and then the NUC now takes it to the National Assembly, but now the requirement is every vice chancellor has to come physically to present his or her budget or that of his university. And the third example is now the recent requirement that no university should recruit any staff, even to fill existing vacancies, without 3 layers of approvals from the federal bureaucracy. You have to go to NUC, you have to go to Office of the Head of Service of the Federation, and you have to go to the Office of the Accountant General of the Federation. All this in conception and intention are beautiful reform programs. But as they are applied in the public sector, they have introduced new dimensions of corruption, which really have very serious negative consequences. With regards to obtaining approval prior to recruitment or replacement of staff, there is now evidence to suggest that vice chancellors have to guarantee slots of staff before what they brought is approved. So they go to all these 3 different places. Maybe they want to recruit 50 people or 100 people. By the time they go back now, the list has been grown to about 100. And most of these are not in the required critical areas, but in the so-called service sector. And it's very, very serious because it's distorting the balance that has been established with regards to the ratio of academic and non-academic staff. It compromises quality because there is no interview. Once you are given a list, you have to now come and just give them offers of admission. And this is very, very serious in the university system. The other thing about, for example, I'm very sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but there is evidence to prove this. I know one university in which, and that's how it complicates the corruption in the university system. A vice chancellor has gone with a small list. He's come back with over 200. And of course, he added his own. And before you realize it, you have so much people added who will not add value to the institution. And with regards to the National Assembly, every vice chancellor has to come to defend his or her budget. And in the process, a lot of deals are made. Either your own requirements for the budget are not approved until you do deals, or if you refuse to do deals, that is cut, or if you agree, then the budget is also padded up. And there are so many examples of all that. And sometimes these padded up programs are so-called community constituency projects. And if you go to many universities, there are many of those projects that are abandoned because the resources go to those National Assembly members who have made the deals. And in the end, the resources are not spent for the project that is supposed to be done. With regards to the issue of the Procurement Act, we have had cases in which it is required that vice chancellors, after certain threshold, which is a very significant amount, they now have to come either to the ministry or to other bodies in order to defend their proposals. And there are also cases where sometimes the due process that has been done is changed and the contract itself is changed. And this happens in most cases when councils have no properly appointed chairman, governing councils. In any case, the Procurement Act has taken a lot of powers with regards to contracts from the governing councils, even though the law has not been changed. So I am saying that these aspects of corruption, as it affects the growth and development of universities, also need to be addressed while we work very, very hard to address those aspects of corruption from within the system. If we do not have a holistic approach of addressing corruption as it impacts the education sector, then obviously a lot of challenges will remain. I have commended ICPC, EFCC, and others. They are really up and doing their best. But given the magnitude of the challenges that they face, really it's like a drop in the ocean, what they are able to do. So that is why I said we require re-strategizing, more focus and attention in order to deal with this. Education, as everybody says, is the foundation of any country's growth and development. And if we do not fund education well, or even the little funds that come into the sector are being stolen brazenly, or a lot of the practices which undermine quality, access, and integrity in the system are allowed, then obviously the entire foundation of progress and development in a country is undermined. So we really need to address this. And I have some suggestions, about 6. I may not have to mention all, but the first one I have already alluded to. It is very, very important to recognize that fighting corruption, particularly with regards to education, cannot be done in isolation. We cannot just focus on corruption within the education sector. And by the way, some of the most prominent cases of corruption that come to public light are issues related to sexual harassment, which are very, very serious and need to be addressed, but in terms of extent and magnitude, they are much, much fewer relative to the other aspects of corruption in the system. So we really need to have a holistic approach, not only to addressing all aspects of corruption within the system, but in particular focusing to those aspects of corruption from the public sector as they impact upon the education sector. Secondly, I think to fight corruption effectively, while the institutions are doing their best, we need to encourage what other countries are doing, which has given results. In this country, we have lagged behind compared to other countries in terms of mobilizing communities to have school management boards that are community-based. It's very, very important to get people of integrity from within the communities to be part of a school management committee that can monitor what is going in terms of access, in terms of quality, in terms of facilities, and the key thing is to get people of integrity. Of course, otherwise it will also become another cycle of corrupt practices. But it's very, very important. Other countries have done it. It has worked. We need to begin to do that. That is inclusiveness in terms of monitoring what goes on in the schools, ensuring the appropriated funds from the government are rightly spent, and also to a large extent minimizing some of the petty corruption that goes in, particularly at the primary, secondary, and some tertiary levels of education. So citizen involvement is very important. Thirdly, I was very pleased to hear the chairman of the ICPC speak about how increasingly tools and technology are being deployed, and this is very, very important. And there needs to be a government policy that emphasizes the increasing use of technology in this regard, whether it is with regards to budgeting or with regards to teaching code of conduct, or with regards to performance-based contracting. I think these are very, very important to not only mitigate, but drastically reduce corrupt practices within the education sector. And I think the fourth recommendation, which may be long-term, is what has been mandated by the United Nations itself, which is the introduction of values such as integrity and anti-corruption education in the school curricula. Again, compared to other countries, frankly, Nigeria is lagging behind. If the young ones are the future of tomorrow, so right from the elementary school, good values need to be inculcated in them. It's not rote learning, and our curricula seems to emphasize that. We need to emphasize the good values of accountability, integrity, selflessness, and eschewing corruption. And it's very, very important for this to be done. Fifthly, the culture of whistleblowing. I think we are doing very well, but we need to strengthen the legal framework that protects whistleblowers and that also provides some incentives for whistleblowing. I think we've come a long way since 2015 in terms of rewarding whistleblowers, but I think there is need to really improve the legal framework. And we need to now scale it down through publicity, public enlightenment and campaigns, so that people will know that if there are very serious issues that affect them, particularly in the education sector, they can complain about them without repercussions and indeed with some incentives for doing so. In conclusion, sir, I would like to say that the effects of corruption in the education sector undermines national capacity to develop requisite national social capital for socio-economic development. And as is very well known, no nation develops without adequate and appropriate investment in education. Regrettably, the Nigerian education sector has suffered neglect and has been chronically underfunded and has been engulfed in a crisis compounded by the impact of corruption, both from within and from the wider public sector. There are two key indices globally that are used to measure what is called the seriousness of a country with regards to education. The first one is what is called expenditure per pupil. And the second one is the percentage of budgetary expenditure allocated to education. If we use these two indices and compare them with many countries globally, we will find that Nigeria is virtually at the bottom. Yes, there is a fear if you give more resources, particularly under the present circumstances, a lot of it will be stolen. But the less you give, the more they steal it, and the more the little becomes too inadequate to satisfy what you require. So really it's very, very important to address this. We have to upscale our priority with regards to education. Although some aspects of corruption within the tertiary education sector gain prominence in public discourses, especially in the media, these reported incidences, as despicable as they truly are, pale into insignificance in contrast to the reckless theft and unprofessional and unethical conduct by public officials given the trust and responsibility of managing the education sector and the way in which they respond to other public officials from outside the public sector. The corruption that takes place within the education sector, I believe, is a dwarf mirror image of what happens in the wider Nigerian context, but with comparatively more consequences. Nonetheless, it is significant enough to attract serious attention and appropriate mitigation measures. I therefore wish to call on all the anti-corruption agencies, where they continue to do the commendable work that they have been doing, to increase the attention they pay to the tertiary education sector, more specifically, but to the state and local government tiers of governance. Because if you ask me, my guess, the statistics are not there, but my guess is that in virtually all the states in this country, less or no more than 40% of the budgeted allocations to education actually translate into educational provisioning. And that is very, very serious. Because then if primary education has no quality, there is low access, secondary education has low quality and low access, no matter how good the university is, the pipeline brings bad people into it. And it becomes very, very difficult, therefore, to train the kind of quality we need. So we need to do whatever is possible to tackle corruption generally, but to also pay particular attention to corruption in the education sector. All hands need to be on deck for a successful accomplishment of this task. May God Almighty continue to help us and guide our leaders appropriately. Thank you very much.